The Symposium, Part 1. When I was a small child, I used to see ghosts that were watching over me as I lay awake in my bed at nights. I saw them vividly, as if they were luminous, and all around them was total darkness. One night, as I was trying to get some of the blanket from my 3 brothers who shared a double bed with me, I saw a young teenage girl, probably about 12 years of age, enter the room through the wall at the bottom of the bed, and I tried to pull what little of the blanket that I had that was covering my abdomen over my head to try and block her from my view. As she reached my feet and started to walk up my body like stepping stones in a garden pond, I laid there petrified and froze like a rabbit in the car's headlights on a country lane, with my terror-stricken body in a cold sweat as she ran over me, totally oblivious of my presence. Another time, in the middle of the night, I saw my mother's ghost, and she was glowing and I was confused because she was sound asleep in the other room. In my later years, I realized that she was astral projecting. Then, in the middle of the day, which was rare, as they mostly came at night, I was upstairs in one of the bedrooms playing with my brothers and sisters while my mother was downstairs cooking dinner, when I saw in plain sight the head of a woman above the partially open door that obscured her ghostly body. I looked at her profile, and she resembled a silhouette on a cameo brooch that my mother used to keep in her jewelry box, that she kept locked away, safe and sound in her bedroom. She had a pale look about her countenance, and her hair was ash blonde and looked like the head of a mop, which I now know was a wig, but at that time I had never seen one. As I looked at her, I screamed in silence, and I was shocked when she craned her neck as she turned around to face me and glared deep into my eyes. I wanted to tell my brothers and sisters what I could see, but I couldn't pluck up the courage to even speak. So I just stood there as motionless as a statue, terrified and in a state of panic and confusion at not knowing quite what to do. Upon reflection, I am not sure why the spirits were watching me, but whatever their reason or intent, they used to scare the hell out of me. Mind you though, they could have been protecting me, because while my mother worked nights, my father was not at home with his children, of which she was unaware. Until one night, when my mother's workmates showed her a newspaper clipping stating that he had been in an accident while driving home with his fiancée after their night on the town, and this was the cornerstone to their inevitable and messy divorce. Coming back to the story, I still remember my mother's reaction about my night visitors around the kitchen table in the morning. She used to say that they were dreams, or a figment of my imagination, but I knew she was wrong. They were not in my mind. I knew that they were ghosts. Years later, when I was in my late teens, my mother told me that my childhood experiences were real, because she had described the ghosts that I was seeing in the night to our neighbors, as I described them to her, of which they replied that they were a perfect description of the people that had lived and died in our house before we moved in. She said that she had shielded me when I was a kid, because she was powerless to help me, and she hoped that the ghost, or spirits, would go away with time. Ironically, she was right, because when I was 10 years old, one night there seemed to be a whole family gazing down at me, and as I lay there terrified, I shouted aloud in their direction, "Close the door." That must have come from my intuitive or unconscious mind, and I did not experience ghosts again until I was 17 in my mother's new house. Basically, when I was decorating my bedroom, I could hear a rasping breath right next to me when I tried to sleep at night, and it did not cease until I had completed the decor of my, or should I say our room. I remember toying with the spirit board with my friends again in my mid-teens, and the spirits would answer our questions, and on top of that my friends and I witnessed cold columns of air encircling all of us. You could reach out and feel them, and if you kept moving your hand, you would pass through them, and we all assumed that they were ghosts. In my late teens, Emily, a family friend, and I began getting scratches on our bodies while we slept at night, which was strange, because we were platonic, and slept in separate rooms and the scratches were too fine to be made by fingernails. Also, Emily used to bite her nails, so unless she grew them back each night, she did not make them. In my early 20s, I was with my girlfriend Stacy, and we both experienced a cold patch that was at the bottom of our bed next to our feet, and we took it to be a cat. Thinking about it now, it was probably the culprit that had made the aforementioned scratches on Emily and I. When I was in my mid-20s, and I was living at the Seven Dials with Tanya, a girlfriend that I was with at the time, we had this bedside cabinet that kept making strange random tapping or knocking noises, and Tanya's dad said that it was probably Death Watch Beatles. But we knew differently, for we were totally convinced that it was paranormal. Next, I saw an animated ethereal bus coming out of the top of it, and when I showed Tanya, she could see it too from her side of the room. Finally, one night I was caught up in a labyrinth of dreams from which I couldn't awake, and when I did, I knew that it was the table that was the cause of the nightmarish maze. So we took it to the back of some derelict houses, smashed it to smithereens, and then burnt it to ash. Then ultimately, going back to my early 20s, when spirits visited me, I used to communicate through automatic writing, and in so doing I began to write down my spiritual experiences, from astral travel to synchronicities, which became the catalyst for this spiritual workbook. Then finally, I had a spiritual experience last weekend that was for me proof of the existence of consciousness after death. As I was sitting on the sitting room sofa chatting to my wife, I felt a presence in the room with us, and I knew that it was my late mother paying me a visit from beyond the grave. I felt a rushing wind at my side, not a column of air like I did with my friends when I was a teenager, but I knew it was a spirit. And then after sitting back down on the sofa, I felt someone hold my hand, and I felt like that they wanted me to channel them through automatic writing. So, I grabbed a pen and paper, and I began to write a message on the pad. It wrote that it was indeed my late mother, and she told me to tell my 40-year-old niece that she was in danger, and that it could be fatal if she didn't resolve it. I texted my niece straight away, and I told her of my mother's warning. She replied by saying that she had missed an appointment to have a smear test at her doctor's, and that could be what my mother was referring to. So I told her to make another appointment to have a check. Next, 2 days later, I saw her daughter's status on my wife's phone, and it read that her mum had cancer. Seeing this, I texted my niece to ask her why my great niece had wrote that message, and she replied that she had been to the doctor and had a smear test like I advised, and it turned out that she had cancer cells in her uterus, and that if I hadn't told her about my otherworldly experience with my late mother, that she was just going to ignore the missed appointment, and she wasn't going to make another one, because she felt that was fit and healthy. So she thought that there would be no point to rebook her appointment. Ever since I was a child, I have always been gregarious, and I loved to express my passion of writing to others. I began by writing and telling poetry when I was a youth, and I used to entertain my school friends with my creative spontaneity in the play areas in between lessons. I had several poems and short stories published in the school magazine, and went on to get one published in a local university paper called The Brighton Voice when I was 21. My schooling was not very dynamic for an academic career, because it was a dead-end school that was closing down, which was caught up in the turmoil of the transformation from secondary to comprehensive education, and the teachers whose jobs were on the line had no time or patience for anyone. I made the most out of it, and I came out with a CSE in English and Geography, which did not give me many options on what profession to pursue. However, I persisted on my writing and hoped that something would come from it, because I felt instinctively, or intuitively, that that was my true path and ambition. It was in my early 20s that a whole new world of writing opened up for me, and it came in the form of spontaneous and/or automatic writing. I would feel a shift in consciousness in the form of a heightened awareness of my five senses, and my voice used to go up a pitch, and you could cut the atmosphere with a knife. When it first happened, I began using it like a psychic, doing party tricks, as I told people their middle names, and I told them about social situations and events that I had no way of knowing. But the most amazing thing for me that it did was when I was working as a night cashier at a local car park, when it told me the correct number of cars that would come out on me in the evening in advance. Basically, it wrote it at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, and when I clocked on at 10 p.m. that evening, the car park was full. Most of the cars were at a conference and they were in for a few days. However, there were cars that were there because the occupants were at a concert, and those cars began to exit the car park at 10:30 p.m. and when they had finished exiting, 34 cars had come out just as it had been predicted. To show me that it was not a coincidence or a fluke, it repeated the prediction the following day, only this time it wrote 32, and that evening its prediction proved correct again. The gig was Chris Rea, and he was at the Brighton Centre for 2 nights. Which I did not know in advance, because the major car parks usually contained the cars that go to the gigs in this area, but my park was under a hotel and off the beaten track, and it usually only dealt with customers that stayed at that establishment or lived in the local area. To put it into perspective, those customers would not begin chaotically looking for a place to park their cars until they were approaching the time of the concert at around 7 that evening, and the writing had told me 2 days in a row at 4 in the afternoon how many cars would decide to park in my car park in advance. Which kind of blows a chaotic or probable world view out of the water, so to speak. I do not think that all our futures are set in stone. But I came to realize that spirits can and did see into the future on these 2 occasions. Or perhaps they guided the potential customers to my car park on those nights. Or perhaps we are all guided in life by higher beings to help us reach our decisions. Today I personally believe in free will, determinism, and spirit working together in much the same way as a jazz band does at a concert. For example, some notes that we play are determined from the script, and then you have free will as they drift off into spontaneity, and some are spiritually inspired as they tap into spirit. Nonetheless, because it predicted the number of cars that would come out 2 days in a row, I reached the conclusion that the writing was not subjective or impulsively erupting from my unconscious mind in a surrealistic outburst. After a time, I took it more seriously, and I realized that it had come through me so that I could spiritually mature, and I left the parlor tricks behind, and it began to give me uncommon wisdom. I must stress that I did not see myself as a prophet, a seer, or a soothsayer. I was, and I quote William Blake when he described himself doing it, I was just the secretary taking notes, or in more modern terms, an interface between the physical and the spiritual realms. When it wrote, it would write that the universe was the creative mind of God, that it was a conscious creative energy that was beyond gender, and that it was humankind's destiny to evolve through the spirit and the flesh to reach a level where they would become equal to God. But I had no objective facts to give it credence or authenticity. I must specify that at that time in my life, although I believed in spirit, I did not believe in God. I just thought that life was a paradox that I had acquired from the wisdom of the punks and the hippies. On the one hand, you had humanity that consisted of wealth, power, greed, sex and violence, and on the other you had spirituality that consisted of love, peace, joy, compassion, harmony and bliss. God was a concept, or a hypothesis, that was our overlord and our creator, to help us have faith that there was a higher purpose to life. It was there to give us a brighter future, or a better tomorrow. Nevertheless, at that time I swayed towards the punk's point of view when they said that at its roots the church was profiteering, manipulating and controlling us by feeding the wants and needs of humanity with false hope, security and desire. Basically, I thought that they had made it all up so they could bathe in the profits out of humanity's social constraints and their spiritual needs. And so I decided to look up various forms of religion to see if under the surface there was more to it than meets the eye, and to see if they had indeed hit on some form of higher wisdom when they were gathering up their coins and wielding their power. But mainly, I was ever the skeptic. For my faith in the writing's authenticity had slipped again, and I wanted to see if it was comparative with what the writing had wrote, to see if it was all mumbo-jumbo created out of wish fulfillment emanating from my unconscious mind, or if it was some kind of spiritual force giving me divine wisdom for me to have, hold and cherish going forward. With today's perspective, when looking at religion, I can only say that I have read that a few centuries back, that the philosophers of that time suggested that religion was an outdated, expensive and useless hypothesis, and the government came to the conclusion that they would stop funding it, and that it would have to survive on charity and handouts on their own, focusing their attention on science instead. However, ironically now, with their latest breakthroughs and new understanding of how consciousness affects subatomic particles in the microscopic universe, scientists are finally coming together with spirit and religion, and it has been reinstated as a useful hypothesis. I think that the world religions, with their warm, loving and receptive arms, do indeed in this day and age help the lonely, lost and needy, and although they all slightly disagree with each other on whose God is real and what you should believe in and follow, that on a fundamental level their ethical codes and principles are all basically the same, and I believe that it does not matter what you believe in as long as you do it with love, hope and charity. On the whole, it's not what you believe that is important, it's what you do that is important, and as long as you live a long, fruitful and harmonious life and see it through an ever-loving, honest, open heart, you can do no harm. Coming back, when I researched to see if there were any relative views, I found that in the West that God was seen as an external creative supernal male entity, and mainly in the East, the universe was seen as God. The Christians of the West believed that we had defied God by eating the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. Because of that, he had turned his back on us and cast us out into the wilderness, where one day, part of him came down to earth personified as Jesus Christ, and we betrayed and crucified him on the cross. Ironically, it is said that he planned it that way because he died for our sins, and if we were to recognize that and go on to follow his teachings, at the end of days, he would return, pass judgment by seeing the Holy Spirit. That was also a part of him, emanate from our beings for having that belief, and then the good from the bad would be sorted, and everyone would be distributed into either heaven or hell according to their having or lacking religious discipline, ethics and faith. I went on to discover that the Gnostics, which was the base root of Christianity along with other pagan belief structures, saw the progression of the soul, but only up into the light. They called the physical the imperfect world created by an imperfect God, and the light the perfect world created by the perfect God, and it was our destiny to realize this through knowledge and lift out of the former to the latter. Then there was the East, where the Tibetan Buddhists believed that at death one will go for a karmic cleansing in the spiritual state, and after the karma was resolved they would go into a pure spiritual state, where they eventually got bored or felt the need to be born again, and so they would physically reincarnate, and then they continued on their cyclic spiritual journey. Then you have Taoism, that believe that you come from the Tao, get born into the world, perfect your mind with meditation, and then scribe your life experiences through the senses back into the Tao as you return to the source. Next, you had Hinduism, that saw us as a wave rising from the eternal sea, to live one's life experiences and then return to the eternal sea at death. They are also caught up on a cyclic journey of birth and rebirth, while they are out of sync with the whole, until finally their karma is resolved and they reconnect to the source, Brahman, or God. Basically, East or West, no one saw us as becoming gods. It is only now 30 years on that modern scholars and thinkers alike are beginning to think this way about God and us progressing on through spirit to become gods ourselves, with the likes of Timothy Leary, and today if conscious realism and the panpsychism mindsets combined. It wrote that in the future that we would find the cure to AIDS and cancer, and for a long time I questioned that, and now they not only have drugs that take away the fatality of AIDS, but just recently, they have made a groundbreaking advancement in our fight against blood cancer by extracting the killer T cells from the immune system and then genetically modifying them to recognize and attack the cancer cells and destroy them when they are reintroduced back into the body. There has also recently been a breakthrough with prostate cancer by injecting seaweed into it to bring it to remission. It was at this time of my life that I decided that with this spiritual database in my grasp, that I could write a book and perhaps bring forth a different perspective of spiritual literature from the writing's viewpoint. Still, before I could begin to write that book, I had to go back to school so I could break free from my subjectivity and give it objectivity and or lucidity, because as I say at that time I did not fully understand anything to do with deep thought, spiritual philosophy, or metaphysics. All I knew was that this strange wisdom that the writing had given me had compelled me to have the impetus and the need to learn and know more about the aforementioned literature. My journey began with going back to school to learn the basics, and at home the reading of good versus evil in the popular horror novels that became available to me to give me solid foundations to begin my search or construct my spiritual structure. As I say, I decided to start with the basics, so I went to a few classes at the Friends Center to make up for my poor education and to bring me up to scratch. I did it in between gardening jobs in my mid-20s, and I did maths, English, creative writing and computer studies on a BBC computer. I loved all the subjects, but I was totally awestruck by the word processing writing package in the latter. I loved the ability to do the grammar check, the cut and paste, and last, but not least, the spell check on the computer. I wasn't that good at spelling because of my adverse or non-existent secondary education, but I was an avid reader, so I could recognize the words and correct myself when I was given the multiple choice that was presented to me with the spell check revealing my spelling errors on the screen. Combined with my creative writing skills, I was soon soaring to untold heights and loving the view. Backtracking, even though I was not academically educated, I loved to read for pleasure, and I began by reading Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, The Lion, The Witch and the Wardrobe, and Gulliver's Travels when I was 11 years of age. I read parapsychology and books on the paranormal in my early and mid-teens, and Sven Hassel's war stories and Jackie Collins's scandalous books in my late teens and early 20s, and I got into popular horror novels in my mid-20s. because as I wrote above, the writing had inspired me to read mysticism, and that was the closest that I was capable of coming to mysticism at that time. Basically, with fiction you passively take in the stories, whereas deep thought and philosophy you become active as you read, then question the literature, and at that time I was not up to that kind of standard, or did not hold that ability. I read the novels all the way up until I was 28, and when I landed a job as a night cashier in a local car park, I had read all the horror books that I could find that roused an interest in me. When I reached that stage, my partner at the time suggested that I should read whatever was in those books that drove me to read them. So I took her advice, and it reawoke that spark that the automatic writing had lit, and I realized that I was now ready to leave the world of fiction behind, and I went on to read non-fiction in its place. I soon began to read philosophy, religion, psychology, science, and above all else, books on spirit, and I still read them up to the present day. I also attended every, although not academic, night school lesson in several colleges that I could find on esoteric and metaphysical subjects right up to my mid-30s, along with astrophysics, psychology, Eastern philosophy, and spiritual disciplines, and even in the present day I use the internet with the utilization of Google and YouTube. Basically, I went wherever my heart or path would lead me. After reading all the books and attending all the college lessons, my wisdom grew, and I rekindled and reinforced the truth that the automatic writing was real, and that some, but not all of it, could be seen as objective, and it began to inspire and influence my own writing. Yes, I had finally reached a plateau where my normal writing was on par with the automatic writing's wisdom, and I took on a more serious role, and I began to write about all the above-mentioned literature and subjects in my own original way. But it was not until I was 42 that my writing took on a more New Age Gnostic approach and/or flavor, and everything began to fall into place. It was around this time that the channeling took on a different route, as it stopped coming through to me consciously in automatic writing. I think that all the reading, studying and analyzing overstimulated my left brain, and that my right spiritual brain became less active. So it began manifesting itself subconsciously in vivid spiritual dream states, when my right brain was active and my left brain was less predominant. There were dreams where I would see spiritual beings that would give me messages, or short stories that were so compelling that I would wake up and then interpret them with my left brain by adding a little research, and then write them down on my computer. It is well documented that we often have spiritual experiences as we drift off into, or drift out of sleep, like Paul McCartney did with Yesterday, Mary Shelley did with Frankenstein, or James Watson did when he dreamt of the DNA's double helix the night before he delivered it. Ever since Socrates, right on through to Gurdjieff and beyond, there have been seekers of truth and wisdom. So it seems that humankind loves to toy with their intellectualism to weigh up subjects such as love, the existence of the soul, the hereafter, and our individual and joint soul purpose, where we serve our God. In my late 20s on through to my late 30s, my partner of that time and I attended various afternoon and evening college courses to do with spirit, wisdom and deep thought, and at the same time we accumulated and voraciously read many books on the same subjects that soon began to affect and sculpture our personalities, emotions, characters, and our souls. After a while, the people that we met through the college courses and the people that we met through serendipity in the streets that we intellectualized with, the former, the college lesson subjects, and the latter on the books that we had read, and they soon became our friends, companions and associates. There was one problem, and that was although that we could talk in between lessons, in the street, or in a public house or cafe, we could not be totally relaxed and satisfied. So it was not long before my partner and I began to hold a series of intellectual and spiritual parties of our own at our flat, where we would all sit about on the floor on yoga cushions, consuming various alcoholic beverages, as we discussed the aforementioned topics, which I have mentioned above. As time went by, the parties seemed to take on a life of their own, as the friends and associates started to bring along friends and friends of friends with the same social, intellectual and spiritual interests and prowess from other colleges, universities, suburbia, the streets, or their social surroundings, and the parties grew in prestige and number. The secret to happiness. In the two most recent surveys on the secret to happiness, the first, it has been suggested that having a career, a partner and owning your own home, or the second, just simply having money and not physical health, as it was previously thought, is what leads to joyful success. Personally, although I do not disagree with their findings, I do think that the secret to happiness does not end there, and it is as diverse as it is relative to each and every one of us. For me, I feel that having clarity, virtue and integrity is very important, and having loving, close and like-minded friends and family in your life to share your journey with is also significant. Being recognized, appreciated and loved also rings one's bells, along with having interesting and enjoyable hobbies for you to work and play with, and a love and appreciation of music, art and literature, plus trying to succeed or complete your soul's purpose and your personal goals and targets. This, accompanied with good health, good food and good living, also adds to the equation, and last but not least, one must have an awareness or a connection to Spirit, God, or whatever you perceive your Creator to be. In a nutshell, the secret to true happiness is having physical, socio-psychological, and spiritual harmony and integrity.